Good afternoon and welcome everybody. My name is Giovanni Carbone. I am head of the Africa program at ISPI. I will introduce and moderate today's roundtable, which is part of ISPI's Mediterranean Dialogues. The roundtable is entitled Between Africa and the Middle East, Geopolitical Competition in the Red Sea. We want to discuss the expanding connections between the two shores of the Red Sea, or even better, between the Middle East and the Greater Horn of Africa, which have brought rising attention to an area that has long been a geopolitical hotspot, and it's an area where several other global and emerging powers are also active. We want to better understand the nature of the growing links between with Middle East actors and Horn of Africa countries. So we invited three experts that I would like to introduce and welcome. They are Brendan Cannon, Assistant Professor at Khalifa University of Science and Technology, Hassan Kanenje, Director at Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Camille Lons, Research Associate at International Institute for Strategic Studies. So thank you all for accepting our invitation and for contributing to the debate today. We will have 3 rounds of interventions by each speaker, each time with individual 5-minute answers. Then we'll take questions from the audience, so please do ask your questions via our social, via Facebook, via YouTube, and we will have a look at them, of course, and try to find time to answer them towards the end. I would like to start with Camille Lons, with say, an introductory question. What are the principal drivers of Gulf states' projection in the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa region?
Thank you. Thanks for having me, first of all. This interest of Gulf states in the Horn is not really something new. They have a long-standing historical relations with the Horn of Africa. But we're definitely seeing a comeback on the Red Sea and on the Horn of Africa of Gulf political agenda since about a decade or so. And there are different drivers. There are, of course, economic opportunities. The Red Sea is a crucial trade corridor for them, especially when getting access to European markets. There's the booming consumer markets also in the Horn itself. Ethiopia, for example, had a double-digit growth rate for almost 10 years until a few years ago. There is, of course, also the interest in the agricultural lands. There are lots of investments of Gulf countries in this area, and they're very cautious of their food security, so it's very important for them. Interest also in resources and raw materials like aluminium. The UAE is also by far the largest importer of Sudanese gold, for example. But beyond economic opportunities, there are also some other factors, security dimension, of course, with the piracy and maritime security issues in the area. The Yemen war also has been like a compounding factor with the need for the countries in the Gulf, especially the UAE, to gain a military foothold on that side of the Red Sea. But also, and probably most importantly, the Red Sea has reemerged as an arena of geopolitical contest and contest between regional powers. So we've seen that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been quite concerned by the influence of Iran. So at the beginning, their comeback to the Horn was mainly focusing on countering Iran. And in most recent years, it's been mostly towards countering the influence of Turkey and Qatar. And this has been a very important driver for their influence in the Horn. But also more broadly, there is an increase of, great power politics in the area, with China also and Russia entering the game. And so it is a geographic arena that is being increasingly seen as the prolongation of a broader strategic landscapes that includes also the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific. So for Gulf states, they're trying to regain control and influence in what they consider to be, their Western strategic flank, and also at a moment when the region itself is going through a lot of political transition. So they are trying to influence also these political processes in the Horn. But just before finishing, I think it's important to note just that when I speak about Gulf states, they actually have different interests and sets of priorities. For Saudi Arabia, the Red Sea is really their direct neighborhood. It's a source of opportunities, but it's also a source of vulnerability. And so for them, it's very important to keep control over that area. While for the UAE and Qatar, it's more about positioning themselves outside of the Persian Gulf. It's about gaining some influence. Also, it's part of a broader strategy for these smaller Gulf states to gain some influence and to hedge also against bigger powers that are their neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia. And so even if we tend to see that the Saudis' interest and the UAE's interest tend to align in the Horn of Africa, they still have some different strategic interests. And sometimes also the Saudis have been a bit annoyed of seeing the Emiratis getting more influence in that area that they consider as being their strategic backyard. So I think overall, what is important to note for Gulf states drivers is this evolution of the security architecture in the Gulf and in the broader region, with the US withdrawing and with this attempt by Gulf states to have more assertive foreign policies and try to reinforce their strategic autonomy. And I think the projection of influence in the Horn of Africa is part of this effort.
Thank you, Camille, for giving us the broad picture of the area. I would like to, Brendan, to to tell us something about one of the issues that Camille touched upon. You talked about the rivalries. We are well aware of the different axes, Turkey and Qatar versus Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But what is the impact of these rivalries on the Horn of Africa and on the alliances with and among the regional actors there? Brendan.
Thank you very much. It's a good question. A lot of this is seen through the lens of the GCC crisis that began in 2017. And I think Camille's right to point out that much of this engagement began prior to that and has been ongoing for a long time. And so in many respects, if we look at this only post-2017, there seems to be this incredible aspect of competition and strategy ongoing, with Middle Eastern powers, Turkey and Qatar on one hand, UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other in the Horn of Africa. And while that's true to a degree, and I think in some respects, some of the Gulf states leaders have bought into this viewpoint post-2017. The other aspect of this is that all along, whether it was Turkey's involvement that began in 2011, Qatar's involvement in Somalia in particular beginning in 2006, et cetera, all of these involvements were done for reasons of domestic politics and regime interest in the countries I mentioned. Furthermore, they tended to dovetail rather nicely with interests of ruling elites in the Horn of Africa states. So I think one of the big upshots of this engagement is actually the hitching of Middle East states' agendas to ongoing agendas across the Horn. There's a couple of different examples I can give you. Abiy Ahmed, the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, his election a few years ago was supported by the UAE. That was pivotal. According to my understanding, in his election, that was something, of course, that Abiy Ahmed was already doing for planning for years before that. Farmajo's election, the current president of Somalia, albeit to many illegitimate, his election in 2017 had something to do with Qatari support and money, although that was not the critical factor in his election. The peace accords between Eritrea and Ethiopia, in which Saudi Arabia and the UAE played a role. This obviously had something to do with an agenda of Abiy Ahmed and his cadre, and we can now see that playing out in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. So I think this rivalry, while extant, has actually paid some dividends to leaders, at least in the Horn of Africa. I don't want to extrapolate this too far and say everything's rosy, because it certainly isn't. But I think we should point out some of the connections, the push and pull between Horn of Africa state leaders on the one hand and Middle East states and their leaders on the other, and how their actions complement one another.
Thank you, Brandon. You touched upon the Horn of Africa countries and on Ethiopia. I would like to ask Hassan Kanenge of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies something more specific about Ethiopia. Ethiopia has no direct access to the sea, but it is the largest by it's far the largest country in the area. It's the Horn of Africa heavyweight, essentially. How do economic developments such as the infrastructural projects and political developments such as the Tigray War impact upon Ethiopia's role in the region and its relations with outside powers? Hassan, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea about 20 years ago, it denied it access, to the sea. And therefore, for much of the last 2 decades, it was a country that was struggling. Now, Djibouti has been able to provide that access. However, the recent events that we've seen, especially the conflict in the Tigray region, has to a certain degree reduced Ethiopia's influence in the region diplomatically and economically, in part because it has affected its economy greatly. But at the same time, the kind of shine that Addis Ababa enjoyed for much of the last few years, especially since the assumption of power by Abiy Ahmed, has disappeared. Now, it's a country, the kind of moves it's making within the Horn region, it's to allow it to have access to that sea. So whether it's the Chinese build railway with Djibouti, which of course accounts for 90% of Ethiopia's import-export trade, and 70% pretty much of the activity that goes on in the port of Djibouti, or its kind of arrangement it's having with Somaliland. Those kind of engagements are meant to allow it access, because without that access, of course, it's problematic. Now, the desire to access the sea has also complicated things in Somalia, for instance. Ethiopia's opposition, for instance, to some federal member states is also informed by its desire, for instance, to have access to Kismayo. Now, of course, that is challenging because the emerging, what we call the tripartite arrangement between Somalia, mostly, of course, Farmajo, Abiy Ahmed, and Eritrea, the Tigray War and the recent attempt at constitutional extension of president's term has affected and has limited the strength and the political power of that alliance. And so increasingly, while in the recent past, Ethiopia pretty much was competing with Kenya, Nairobi, as a regional hegemon, recent events have actually affected its ability to be able to project power and to influence events, despite the size of the country being a very big country with more than 110 million people. And I think what happens going forward, especially with regard to addressing the internal dynamics in the Tigray region and moving towards democracy and holding elections, and how the type of role they're going to play in Somalia are going to determine the place of Ethiopia within the Horn of Africa, within the African continent at large.
Thank you. Back to Brandon. Brandon, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates played a role in brokering the peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea. On the other hand, it appears that Qatar and the United Arab Emirates arguably contributed to fueling instability in Somalia. How should we consider, how should we look at the involvement of Gulf countries in the region? Is it predominantly an involvement that brings about more instability, or does it have a potential for stabilizing a historically unstable region?
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm going to do a bit of fence sitting here, which is probably not wise in a forum like this, but I think it's we see both aspects of this. We see the Saudi Emirati cooperation, at least to a degree, in bringing about a peace deal that, for all intents and purposes, when it was first mooted, seemed to blindside Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea. That ended up being a good thing on one hand for both Ethiopia and Eritrea, or at least the regimes in both countries, but a bad thing for the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which we now see and the conflict that's ongoing there. And so it's a bit difficult to fall on one side of the fence or the other. In terms of Somalia, yeah, this has really been the ground zero of UAE, Qatari play, particularly post-2017. Farmajo attempted to rather skillfully play off both states, but given his close relations with Doha, and particularly that of his presidential advisor at the time, Fahad Yassin, who's now head of the National Intelligence Service, he really couldn't shrug off Doha completely, and so he attempted to maintain a neutral stance. That angered the UAE, which took the hardest line of any GCC state against Qatar, and this resulted in really the removal, both by the Somali side as well as withdrawal by the Emirati side of UAE presence in Mogadishu. That included training camps and aid for security services there that have been ongoing for about 5 years. Now, that has not ended necessarily the attempts to rejigger the map, if you will, in Somalia. The UAE has, in some respects, doubled down in the independent, de facto independent, but internationally unrecognized Republic of Somaliland. Dubai's DP World, a major ports operator, they signed a deal, a tripartite deal with Ethiopia, the Republic of Somaliland, Ethiopia, the Republic of Somaliland, and DP World signed a tripartite deal 5 years ago for the expansion and refurbishment of the port of Berbera. That would assist Ethiopia get out of its landlocked situation that Hassan just referred to. That also at the time supposedly included a military base for the UAE, which was involved in Yemen at the time. That, to my understanding, has never actually occurred. However, the UAE recently upgraded the status of its representative to the Republic of Somaliland, certainly not to that of an ambassador. There's no international recognition by the UAE, but it was another poke in the eye at Mogadishu, aimed at to really express the UAE's displeasure with the ruling regime in Somalia. So there's no doubt that I think the UAE sees a real problem overall in Mogadishu. The Qatari influence in the ruling class, at least with Farmajo and his cadre, but also the bigger issue of Turkey's involvement there and the Turkson military base that trains the Somali National Army. These issues or these occurrences, particularly the training of the Somali National Army by Turkey, really have the possibility of overthrowing existing orders within Somalia itself. Hassan mentioned the breakaway state of Jubaland. Of course, I've mentioned the Republic of Somaliland, and it's safe to say that many of the people in both places, Kismayo and Hargeisa, respectively, are very fearful of what could occur should the SNA, the Somali National Army, grow stronger under the aegis of Turkey.
Thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Camille Lons of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, back to you. Another important player in the area is Egypt. To an extent, Egypt is aligned with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but there are also issues, regional issues, on which they don't fully agree. They don't have the same stance or positions. To what extent are they cooperating as opposed to competing over specific issues in the region?
Well, it's a complex relationship because in general, beyond the Red Sea and the Horn question, Egypt has been quite dependent financially from Gulf states. Between 2013 and 2016, for example, they received about $30 billion from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Including a series of central bank deposits and bailout packages. The bulk of this aid came after the Arab Spring, and there was a moment when Gulf countries were competing to influence the political process in Egypt. Egypt also receives a lot of remittances from workers that were in the Gulf. So there is a very important relationship. And they have been, because of that, a bit politically tied to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But at the same time, it's a country that remains very proud and that is conscious of itself as a regional power. And so it is reluctant to get completely dictated by Gulf states. And this includes as well on politics of the Horn. Because Sisi sees Egypt sees the Horn as a strategic backyard of Egypt, and he sees Horn dispute and especially the Renaissance Dam issue as African issues. And for example, he's been quite annoyed by Gulf interference in the Horn, although he couldn't really necessarily say it officially, but. On the Red Sea Council that was set up by Saudi Arabia early 2020, that was an initiative that was led by Egypt originally. There was an initial meeting in Cairo in December 2017, and the Saudis have retaken the lead on this project, and they have also changed slightly the orientation of the project to make it more strategic focused, security focused, and the Egyptians feared that the Saudis would make it a tool of Saudi influence in the region, and same thing for the GERD dispute. They have been, Egypt has been seen a bit as a treason, the fact that Gulf countries have been more balanced than what he expected them to be. At the end of the day, officially, they have supported Egypt because they had to support Egypt on this issue with Ethiopia, but they have close relations with Abiy Ahmed, and they have proposed to mediate the dispute, but and obviously as well, they have important economic interests as well in seeing the GERD being materialized, because they have important investments in Sudan's agricultural lands. So Egypt has been quite annoyed by this. And from Gulf countries' perspective, and from the Saudi and the UAE perspective, there's also the fact that Egypt is, of course, an important partner, a regional cornerstone of regional stability, but it has lost a little bit its strategic importance for Gulf states, and sometimes it had become a bit more a burden than an opportunity. And their priorities have evolved over recent years. So the relationship has been a bit tense. But at the same time, yes, Egypt cannot really do differently, and it has been trying also to obtain still and cooperate with Gulf states on some of these issues. So On the Red Sea Council, for example, they have managed to obtain concessions from the Saudis in terms of excluding the Ethiopians from the organization. They also have conducted some maritime exercises in the Red Sea with the Saudis and the Emiratis. There was quite a good representation from these two countries when they launched the Berenice Bays. But it's definitely a complicated relationship of both cooperation and competition in the Horn.
Thank you, Camille. You touched upon a very crucial issue, the building of the Nile Dam, which is, let me remind the audience, is this big dam that Ethiopia is building in its own territory, claiming full sovereignty about what they do at home, but it will affect inevitably the flow, the downstream flow of water through Sudan and towards Egypt. And this created a very tough dispute that has been going on for quite some time, having to do with control of the water flow, as well as with the timing of the filling of the dam. What is your take on this, Hassan? How do you think the dispute about the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is affecting and will affect relations with the Gulf states, within the region, between Ethiopia and Egypt? Because this really is possibly today, the issue that has the greatest potential for an interstate clash in, I would say, in the whole of Africa, possibly. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's true. The Renaissance Dam is perhaps one of the most difficult questions and potential causes of a wider conflict, especially in the Horn of Africa, in the larger Horn of Africa region. Now, historically, Egypt relies very heavily, if not almost exclusively, on the Nile. As they say, the Nile is Egypt and Egypt is Nile. Now, the trouble is most of the waters that get into the Nile come from Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, of course, is citing its sovereignty rights to be able to use its own resources. Now, the challenge, of course, with that, there is a chance that it may affect the water flow, to Egypt. And so that may affect the economy of Egypt. Now, within the region, this has complicated things. In fact, when you look even at the place of Gulf states, for instance, the initial approach of Gulf states was an endorsement of the Egyptian position. The Arab League initially endorsed the Egyptian position. But at the same time, you find Gulf states, they're allying themselves with some players such as Abiy Ahmed. Now, within the region, on this issue in particular, you find now Sudan is working very closely with Egypt, but Sudan is having a conflict with Ethiopia at the same time. Now, Egypt, in recent days, weeks, has conducted a lot of what we call shuttle aggressive diplomacy within some countries of the Nile Basin, and is probably trying to build some kind of cloud so it can be able to make a case within the African Union and the United Nations Security Council with regard to this question. But this essentially, while it is essentially an African problem, I do not think the efforts, just going by the efforts have been made. Of course, there was a failure in Washington, in part because of the perception that President Trump wasn't fair. The South African effort, of course, also failed. And absent of more robust international involvement, especially with regard to attempts to resolve this issue, I think the two countries are going to be unable to do that. Now, this is a very emotive and nationalistic issue in Egypt. But at the same time, in Ethiopia, it is the single largest infrastructural investment, perhaps in the history of the country, that holds potential not just to Ethiopia, but to supply power to neighboring countries. And so economically, it is something that is critical. But in the wake of the Tigray crisis conflict, Abiy Ahmed is at his weakest. And at this stage, it's unlikely that he will be willing to make any concessions with regard to the dam. Now, on the other hand, the Nile issue being a very nationalistic, very very sentimental, not sentimental, very nationalistic, but also very economically very vital. Egyptians tend to see it as an existential threat, anything that threatens to reduce the waters of the Nile. And so when you look at all these complexities that are taking place, you know, around it, and with no prospect or framework that is going to move the two countries closer to negotiation or closer to an agreement, we are looking at a situation that is not exactly palatable, and it's not sustainable, so to speak. And those of us, especially who do an analysis and in this region, is going to require a more meaningful intervention by the international community with sufficient carrots and sticks to force the parties to reach an agreement, because the Egyptians today, they're not in a position to compromise, especially on the critical question of the length it takes to fill the dam. Now, on this other hand, Abiy Ahmed is very weak politically internally to be able to make a compromise on that front. And so that leaves us in a place that is not very comfortable as a region, and especially when it comes to the question of the Renaissance Dam, because the African Union and IGAD's efforts have failed. The United States tried in isolation, of course, it failed. And so it's going to take something more than that, and something more consistent, something sustained in terms of effort, and something deliberate to be able to bring the parties to some kind of an agreement. Because the previous treaties, of course, with regard to the Nile, excluded most of the countries that are actually either the sources of the Nile or or rather they're affected by the Nile. And I think that is where the emotional and the existential issue comes about, because the sense of exclusion for many years since 1929, of course, and then 1959 treaties is one thing that is pushing, for instance, Ethiopia to decide or to insist that they will want to have a say in the use of their own waters, and Egypt should not be able to dictate how they're going to use that water. And so it's going to require, as I mentioned, a more meaningful, more sustained intervention by the international community to be able to bring the parties together. Absent of that, I think it's going to be a crisis of unspoken magnitude.
Yes, but Ethiopia has some key advantages on this dispute. I mean, one is the location of the dam, which is in Ethiopian territory. And that one is time. They have no incentive to find a solution. They can drag it on, since their aim is to fill the dam, and they've started already. And also they can agree or not agree on whether international mediators could be involved, and they are so far rejecting the involvement of additional international mediators, over which they feel they cannot maybe exert enough influence. Do you see the potential there for Egypt to actually move to action?
Yeah, I think Egypt has stated, and it seems to be very keen on this, that they may take unilateral action against the dam, or rather the construction. Now, that is a possibility. The challenge, if that happens, then it's going to lose the kind of moral authority right now and claim that it has. And so it may actually lead to a backlash, especially from the Nile Basin countries. And so it may create a situation where even these countries try to sabotage the water that's supposed to be going, to Egypt. And so it is a very risky action if Egypt were to decide unilaterally to go ahead. But based on, of course, the sentiments from Cairo, is they are determined to do something to either stop the construction, but in a way that is not going to create a backlash. And I think that is part of the reason why Cairo is trying to undertake some shuttle diplomacy with a number of countries around the region. So in the event that happens, at least perhaps they will hope that the region will understand the Egyptian position, and perhaps they will paint Ethiopia as the bad guys. However, it's still a very complex and a very risky move to be able to undertake. And so ultimately, I think Egyptians will be better informed to work with other countries within the continent, but especially also outside, with sufficient sticks and carrots to be able to bring both parties to bear, because even Egypt will have to make compromises, just as much as Ethiopia will have to make compromises on that. But without sticks and carrots to bring to these parties, it's going to be very difficult to reach some kind of an agreement.
Thank you, Hassan. Let's move for a moment to the other side of the Red Sea. There's a conflict there, of course, the conflict in Yemen. What is the impact of this conflict on the region and on the relationships between Middle Eastern powers and Horn of Africa countries? Brendan, can you tell us something about this?
It has been tragic, frankly speaking. It has been tragic. It has made the problem.
Hassan, may I interrupt you? I just to make sure we have some time for the others as well. I wanted to ask this to Brendan.
Oh.
Sorry.
Oh,
thanks.
Okay. Sure. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. So the impact. I assume you're asking about the impact of the ongoing conflict in Yemen and the Horn, and that has been quite interesting in that it really did bring certainly further Emirati involvement in the Horn. Post 2015, with the Saudi-led coalition that entered the conflict in Yemen, this really was the genesis, for example, of Emirati rapprochement, or at least negotiations with Eritrea for the opening of the Assab naval base, as well as the airstrip there. And that was a major focus of their operations and resupply in Yemen. Now, that was critical. There were issues as well that have been reported about the usage of mercenaries, primarily from Sudan, the Port Sudan region, by the warring parties. So that's also had an impact. I think this is part of what Hassan began to say, rightly so, has been quite catastrophic. You have a situation in a place like Hargeisa that I saw in 2018, when you had initially Somalilander refugees that had gone to Yemen to flee the situation in Somalia, particularly after the beginning of the 1988 civil war. They ended up coming back to Somaliland and were refugees again in their own country. You had a lot of Yemenis also going across the Gulf of Yemen to Somaliland, to Djibouti, etc. And so that's been quite disastrous as far as those societies are concerned as well. Beyond that, as I mentioned, the Yemen crisis, I think, added fuel to this fire that led to the GCC crisis. And that in turn had its impact across the Horn of Africa. But the flip side of this, or maybe the good side, as I mentioned in my first comment, or I referred to in my first comment, is the rapprochement between Eritrea and Ethiopia that occurred. Partially, I would say, as a result to Saudi and Emirati engagement with the regime in Eritrea, which had been quite isolated. And so this allowed them, I would assume, the amount of leverage needed to push, or at least convince President Afwerki that the peace deal with Ethiopia was possibly in his best interest. As it turns out, of course, Afwerki grasped at that, and we can see the results between the movements in Tigray there. So that's what I would say would be the major results of the Yemen crisis in the Horn of Africa. More engagement, particularly by Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the Horn, which, if we look at the entire picture, is not always rosy, but not always doom and gloom either.
Brandon, let's try to expand even more the picture. Camille, among foreign powers involved in the region, there's not just Middle Eastern powers, but of course there's many others, among them China. The Belt and Road Initiative sees the Horn of Africa as a strategic, and the Red Sea as a strategic area and route. What are the main interests and the kind of presence that Beijing has been developing in the area?
So yes, definitely. I mean, China is a major player in the Horn. On the economic side, it has even greater weight than Gulf countries. And even if it's in terms of investments, even if on Beijing's side, it remains a drop of its investments in the world. On the side of Horn countries, who are struggling to get access to international funding and to get some investments, this represents a real this can have really like a real geoeconomic impact. And so in terms of the drivers for Beijing's interest in the region, they're mainly economic. It's a bit like for the Gulf states. There's the fact that the Red Sea is a major maritime trade route that connects to markets in Europe, so it's extremely important for the BRI. The region is very rich in terms of natural resources, so minerals, crude oil. Sudan, for example, was for a long time a very important source of oil for China. It was about like 7% of its total oil imports until 2011. Although that element of the energy element has reduced a bit over the past 10 years because there has been like security factors, but also the fact that China has been diversifying its provision of energy. And so the region has become a bit less important for China, but it's still quite important. There is obviously the fact that it's an entry door to African markets. Countries with booming populations, a lot of opportunities for Chinese construction companies, for example, in the Belt and Road Initiative. They have undertaken a number of projects like the Addis Ababa Djibouti Railway, for example, although this one is a bit controversial, the port of Djibouti, etc. So a lot of interest for China as well, like in terms of digital infrastructures as well, which is something that we talk usually a bit less about, but Huawei has built over 70% of the 4G networks across Africa. So yeah, lots of economic opportunities, quite a very asymmetrical relationship with the region. But the drivers are not only economic, and there are also some strategic drivers that are becoming more important. So the fact that China has established a base in Djibouti and that it is expanding it over time. It is increasingly also considering the Red Sea as, and the Red Sea and the Western Indian Ocean as a kind of continuation of the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific as a strategic space. And with that, necessarily trying to become a security player in the region, because they're quite happy with letting the US bear the security burden. But it's a way to gradually gain experience, in overseas missions like the rescue operation from Yemen or the base in Djibouti. It's a way to gain experience, to boost their credentials as a global power. It's a way also, in the case of the base in Djibouti, to collect some intelligence on other bases, because you have a lot of international, bases from different countries gathered in Djibouti. It's one of the most militarized regions in the world. And so for the Chinese, having a foothold in this area is a very good way to monitor also what other powers are doing. As we were talking also about intelligence gathering, there are also like the fact that, for example, in Ethiopia, hosts the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. And there was this case, for example, of the data theft or allegations of data theft by China on the AU headquarters in Addis, where Huawei was in charge of the IT infrastructure. So it's a region where a lot of things happen. And so for Beijing, having a presence there is quite useful. It's also a way, I mean, the more they're present in the Red Sea, the more they force the US to focus a bit more on the Red Sea, and the less the US is going to have capacities to focus more on the South China Sea or on the Asia Pacific at large. So that's also one of the, general rationales. And overall, there is also the question of gaining geoeconomic leverage. The fact that a lot of these countries who are, cash strapped, who are having difficulties to access financing, international financing, and that are extremely dependent then on Chinese financing. This is giving some leverage to China to try to influence some of these countries, for example, in the support that they give in international forums. For example, the Uyghur issue is a very good example. Almost all the countries in the Horn of Africa, I think with the exception of Ethiopia, have signed this open letter for the UN on Xinjiang, for example. A number of them as well have supported China on the July 2016 arbitration on South China Sea. So these are, interesting elements to watch on how China slowly is also leveraging some of these geoeconomic presence in different countries, and including in the Horn of Africa, to support its own political interests in other theaters.
Thank you, Camille. And that's for China. Russia is on a very different scale, possibly also has interests in the region. I would like to hear from Hassan about Russia's efforts to gain a presence in Sudan. Sudan is a country that we have only very briefly mentioned, but it's part, of course, of the greater Horn of Africa. What kind of international competition, what kind of international presences are there in Sudan, whether Russia or Turkey or what other countries are trying to exert influence over Sudan?
Okay, thank you. You are breaking a little bit, so I think, can you just repeat that last part, if you don't mind?
To ask you what kind of presence, external influences, what kind of relations is Sudan developing with outside powers?
Yeah, you had mentioned Russia. Now,
well, yeah.
I think based on even the discussion today, we know that, the Horn of Africa has become the next theater of global geopolitics, especially when it comes to the global South. And the amount of competition we are seeing, of course, reflects, and interest in the region reflects this newfound status as the next theater for geopolitics. Now, recently, of course, Moscow announced its intention to set up a naval base in Sudan. Now, I think it's important to understand that Moscow's move is partly informed in the fact that I think following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia had retreated back, to its borders. But increasingly, they are trying to look outward. Now, outside, of course, the Black Sea and Tartars port in Syria, Moscow does not have any other port, around the world, and especially on the continent. Now, Sudan serves as a critical part. Number one, it's right within the Horn of Africa. But number two, it can serve also as a forward base for its other activities, especially in the Central African Republic. Number three, the Russian Federation is what we call the Johnny-come-late list. it's not part of that group of countries that already have a presence in Djibouti or have bases elsewhere. And so they thought perhaps to have an arrangement with a country like Sudan was going to be helpful. And it's something that the previous president, al-Bashir, had started discussions with. And so it was simply formalized, in recent months. Now, Sudan is at a place that is not enviable for many transitioning countries. Economically, it has suffered under sanctions. The transition right now is not going very, very well. And the reason I'm saying that because the transitional government that is made up of both the military and the civilian, the military seems to be busy in striking certain deals with countries, a lot of times without considering what the population actually thinks, or the civilian branch of that government. Now, for instance, prior to the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, we know that al-Bashir had decided, for some time, was dealing with Turkey, was dealing with Qatar, was dealing with Iran. And immediately after his overthrow, we saw that leading Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates injected billions of dollars pretty much overnight. And part of it was to buy loyalty from the military wing of the government, which of course is the most powerful. And most of the foreign policy today is being dictated by that. So when we look at the behavior of Sudan, we have to look at it within the prism of the power of the military within this transitional government. The challenge we have is whether the civilian government that after the transitional period is going to abide by some of the arrangements and agreements that the military government has made. Now, the trouble for both the civilian and the military wing of the government, which is the Sudanese government, is both of them need resources. And so you find them working in a very calculating way to try and balance interest, even though some of those interests are difficult to balance because of their dire need for resources, for investment, for capital, for aid, and for kind of assistance that they need just to function as a state. Inflation is through the roof. Joblessness is very high. The COVID has destroyed the already worse economy. And so its actions are much a reflection of the pain that the population and the government is feeling, as opposed to some kind of independent policy that you'll have expected to get from Sudan about maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And so whether it's its alliance with some certain Gulf countries, or its restoration of diplomatic relations, so to speak, with Israel, a lot of it has to do with its desire to be rehabilitated within the international system, to be assisted, and to be able to be allowed to access international financing and investment so they can be able to rebuild that country.
Let me now raise some of the issues that I read in the questions from the audience. So this question is for the three of you, actually. The question is, can the USA apply a new security order in the Red Sea region? Maybe we can, in a sense, broaden it a little bit and say something about US interests and activities in the region. It surprises me in a sense that Washington has hardly been mentioned so far. It's such a key strategic area. We have mentioned several countries. We know that the US have a military presence there in Djibouti, but then I leave it to you to elaborate this further. Camille, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. So very, very general question. I would say the problem for Washington at the moment is that there is a temptation to try to reduce their presence in the region, or at least try to rethink how to, be present, but in a way that is a bit smarter and using less economic and security capital in the region. And one temptation would be, and that is a bit dangerous, to try to outsource some of their security interests to the regional states, and including to Gulf states, because they have been trying to engage more Gulf states in some of the regional issues, which is a good thing in itself. So we've seen, for example, on the Grand Renaissance Dam issue, they have tried to engage more with Gulf states, with the Saudis and the Emiratis, trying to see if they could, provide some financial packages as part of a more general political settlement. They have tried to also to see if the Emiratis could potentially put pressure on the Eritreans on the current Tigray crisis. So they're trying to engage Gulf countries more in the region, which is a good thing. But at the same time, it's very important that the US remains strongly present, because they have this ability this authority to be one of these mediating powers in the region, and they should still be conscious of the fact that their interests and their vision of what stability means still differs from the vision of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they still have some important differences there. So it's a complicated, I think, a mix to find in the way to engage Gulf states in the Horn.
Thank you, Camille. Brendan, Hassan, do you want to add something to this? Brendan?
Yes, please. Thank you. This is going to cover a little bit of what Hassan said already in reference to the Russian military base. So, look, the U.S. is a resident power in the region. There's no such thing as a new Red Sea order. There's close to 50,000 troops, U.S. troops in the Gulf region alone. You've got the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. You have the 6th Fleet, some of it in the Mediterranean. And so the U.S. is the dominant power in the region, even though the perception and to a degree the reality of troop drawdowns has occurred. So removal of troops from Somalia, for example, there were about 700 by President Trump. They're now in Manda Bay in Kenya, just to the south of Somalia. Removal of troops from Iraq, upcoming troop removal from Afghanistan, but it really doesn't change the balance of power much. And I don't think there's much pressure to reduce the American presence in the region, with the exception of these hot button places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I've never heard a conversation in Washington about a withdrawal from the Gulf, for example. And so I think that is something that probably needs to be placed in context. And then the other thing is there's been a lot of hyperbole about these bases that other external states have, whether it's the Russians who are going to build their logistics support center in Sudan, the Chinese base in Djibouti, which is frankly a little more worrisome, or the Turkish training facility in Mogadishu. These are not really power projection nodes in the way that Al Udeid base is in Qatar for the Americans. And so I think that this we've still maybe got somewhat of a Cold War mentality, where bases are things that bristle with missiles and tanks and troops, and you can project force into the interior of a country or region. I mean, that's just not the case with any of these. And so the Red Sea order, whether it comes about through Saudi initiatives, Egyptian initiatives, Emirati initiatives, or something from the Horn itself, is going to be somewhat of a smaller player, if you will, albeit something that the U.S. might encourage. Camille alluded to this, certainly with Washington's actions with certain Gulf states. But it's not going to necessarily be a game changer as far as distributions of power in the region.
Brendan. Hassan, let me read you another of the questions that we have received. What are the implications of terrorist groups' activities on the power competition in the region? how can they affect it? The issue is, I would say, are there connections between terrorist activities in the Horn and external competition in the area? Can you see any? Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah. To some degree, and especially the competition between or among Gulf countries, what we call in this part of the world, the Gulf Cold War. The Gulf Cold War has had an effect of supporting certain factions within countries that have actually turned either into terrorist groups or they were conducting terrorist activities in those countries, and particularly in Somalia. A lot of militias you find right now, they were supported by one part, either the Turkey-Qatar alliance or the Emirati, Saudi alliance, and so a lot of them have. Perhaps that was not the intention, but ultimately that was the effect, just like it happened in Syria. Now, the other challenge has been, of course, the war in Yemen and the kind of spillover effects it has on the Eastern Africa. So this chain of or stream of wars that have been taking place, in large part also funneled by the competition that is going on because of the amount of money that is unaccounted for that has been coming into the Horn of Africa, is a cause to worry. And I think it's something that has to be addressed because in the absence of that, it's going to be difficult. Just not too long ago, of course, we know that Eritrea was accused to be supporting terrorist groups inside Somalia. Of course, things are now changing because of the new administration or the outgoing administration of Farmajo, which has been, having friendly relations with Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea. And so, yes, that kind of, especially the Middle Eastern powers rivalry has contributed to that. But it is not so much about, let's say, the big power rivalry between, let's say, Chinese and the Americans. I think that has had limited effect with regard to the growth of terrorist groups. In fact, what it has actually done is the U.S. involvement has been robust, as Brandon just mentioned, in terms of the power projection and balance of power within the region by the big powers has not fundamentally changed. What has changed is the perception, especially for the last 4 years, of a hands-off approach by the United States. And that, of course, has taken something away from it in terms of its ability to mobilize. But going with a flurry of engagements by Joe Biden with leaders in the region, lots of phone calls, some of them which we are aware of. I think there is a renewed interest by the United States in the Horn of Africa, again, to perhaps restore the place it had during the Obama administration.
Thank you, Hassan. I want to use our last minutes, maybe with 1 minute for each of you, to address another question that has been raised, which is maybe, I'll leave it to you. How is the pandemic affecting the dynamics in the Red Sea region, if ever? What could be the future of the region after the pandemic? Do you see an impact of the pandemic? I mean, of course, on individual societies, but can you see an impact on the evolution of relations among countries in the region, or the presence of external countries in the Horn? Who wants to start? Very quick answers, possibly 1 minute each. Who wants to kick off? Camille, please.
I could go on for hours on this, but to say quickly, I would say from the Gulf perspective, I think the main question is about with the financial hits that this crisis has been, combined also with like the decrease of oil prices and this kind of issues. The big question is to what extent they're going to have the financial ability to continue project power and influence in the area to the same extent that they have done in the past. And the thing is that this reflection actually has been starting a bit before also the COVID crisis. So it's not necessarily directly linked to the COVID crisis itself. There was already like some sort of reflections on, because some of the investments that they have made in the region have not always led to either the economic profitability or the political reactions that they expected. And so there might be a bit of recalibration on that sense. And the COVID crisis is probably also going to limit the financial levers that they had to have influence in the region.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Giovanni. So to continue from Camille's answer, yeah, I think you're seeing the pandemic exacerbated U.S.-China tensions. You might see those play out a little more in the Red Sea region. Certainly what Hassan mentioned as far as the U.S. is back, face of the Biden administration seems to be having a limited effect for the time being, and certainly is the polar opposite of the absolutely hands-off Trump administration for the past 4 years, where the Gulf states might come out smelling quite good here, particularly the UAE, I'll say, and I'll point directly to the UAE, is with vaccine diplomacy. And so this might be something, this is certainly something they've been doing to multiple countries. I believe they will put this into effect in the Horn of Africa. They're producing Sinopharm vaccines here. So potentially in concert with China, vaccine diplomacy could play a role in this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Hassan, do you want to conclude by adding something on this topic?
Yeah, perhaps just a little, since what I was going to say has been said by my colleagues. Yeah, of course, COVID has changed the dynamic, and I think it has had a huge effect on international relations generally. Now, for African countries, I think Gulf countries, some of them have found an opportunity to be able to say, to use, as Brendan mentioned, vaccine diplomacy. But beyond that, also some kind of financial support in terms of rebuilding the economies that post-pandemic is going to be critical in the level of influence actually going to have on the region, on the Horn of Africa region, by and large. Outside that, when it comes to big powers, I don't see that changing dramatically with regard to its effect on the Horn of Africa, but the Middle Eastern countries, most certainly China, it has exploited that for, I would say, soft power purposes, and it's succeeding to a considerable degree, but it's not there yet.
Thank you, Hassan. I think we cannot but conclude that this is really an extraordinarily complex chessboard and a very complex area with relations that are fast evolving among regional and external powers. And I really thank you for helping us trying to shed some light on, given our time constraints, of course, on this very interesting, challenging area. So thanks to Brendan Cannon of Khalifa University, to Hassan Kanenje of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, and to Camille Lons of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks again. Thank you to our audience, and I hope we'll have future chances to hear from you about the evolution of this strategic area. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.